Well, welcome everybody to the Lunch and Learn series. Warm welcome to you wherever you are throughout Queensland. And we are about to get underway, and we've got a number of people coming in at this stage to the broadcast. So I'd be interested to make sure that I'm being well heard. So in the question box, could I just ask people who are now registered online if you could just type in the word clear, just so that I know that I'm being heard. That would be really great. And once we're settled and ready to go, we will start. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Joe. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Blake. All right. That sounds like it's coming across loud and clear, which is wonderful. So, again, welcome, and Friday. So, all looking forward to a really nice weekend, I hope. Here in Brisbane, it's fine and sunny for a change. We've had an interesting week, but I know people in rural Queensland have needed the rain, and I'm not sure how much you've got, but I'm hoping that there has been a lot of rain for some of those outdoor areas, outback places in Queensland. All right, so let's get underway. Just quick recap and understand where we're at in relation to the 6 modules that we've covered. We looked at influencing capabilities, in fact, in module 2, and we gave you the opportunity to consider how you might best influence other people. We looked at strategically managing performance and some of the critically important aspects of that. In Module 3, it was all around managing yourself and your space and creating that thinking time and that capacity to create an opportunity to breathe and think about what you're doing with your people. And of course, last time, 2 weeks ago, we looked at options for organisational restructuring or structuring, and I provoked you to think a little bit differently about how you structure your workplace or your unit or whatever you're in charge of. Today we're going to look at negotiation and conflict management, and you'd be aware that I would have sent you a profile to complete, and hopefully you've had a chance to complete that. If you haven't, you'll still get something out of the presentation, but I'd suggest to you that at the end of the presentation you go and complete the profile so it can give you a bit of a context about how you like to negotiate and how you like to deal with conflict, which is essentially what that profile is all about. So if you've got it, have it handy if possible so that you can refer to it, because I will be encouraging you to refer to that during the presentation for the next hour. And of course, if you've got questions and comments and observations, you know what to do in the question box. Just type them in whenever you're ready, and I will stop the broadcast and respond to those questions. So, and of course, you'll get a copy of the slides, you'll get a copy of the recording as well at the end of this presentation. So we're really going to, as I said, look at negotiation and conflict resolution skills. And just a couple of comments. I mean, conflict's not something that I think people are naturally good at. Some people are better at it than others. But at the end of the day, if you're in a senior leadership role, it's inevitable that you'll come across conflict in all sorts of different ways, whether it's with your council, whether it's with your colleagues, whether it's with the team that you lead, whether it's cross-functional. There'll inevitably be differences of viewpoint where you have to negotiate a particular path. So what the profile was actually trying to do was to establish for you some preferred ways of dealing with conflict, just like we did with the influencing capabilities profile. What I want to do here is give you an opportunity to consider how you like to deal with conflict. And that's really the essence of what today's about. Your homework from last time, I asked you to consider making some changes to your structure or perhaps discussing them with your team for feedback. So maybe you haven't done, you may not have done any structuring. Maybe it's confirmed that what you're doing is fine, but I hope you've at least considered it and how it might look in terms of what you do, because as I said, in local government, we're very much based on silos. We're very based on the functional model, and that's not always conducive to good communication across the organisation. And the public whom you deal with really aren't interested in all of the machinations and structures that go on inside council. They're really interested in getting their problem dealt with. So the job that you have is to try to make the structure as user-friendly as you probably or possibly can. So I hope you've had a chance to think about that, and I'm always open to you sharing your observations with me via email, and you've got my email address, and more than happy to respond to anybody's questions or whatever, or if you want to ask questions here, you can do so as well. So what are we going to be covering today? We're going to look at political awareness to start with, because at your level in the organisation, you need to be politically savvy. And I come across people often who are even in senior positions say to me that, look, I'm not interested in politics. I just come to work. I want to serve the community the best I can, and I don't like to get involved in politics. Well, I've got news for you. You are involved whether you want to be involved or not. And so the key for you is to become good at being politically aware. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. I'm also going to talk about the model underpinning the conflict and negotiation profile that you've completed, and I'll ask you to refer to your results when I go through the model. I'm actually going to talk about 5 different ways of dealing with conflict and negotiation, and I'm going to ask you to consider those 5 ways and different situations. So really, like influencing, this is really about you becoming more flexible and, broadening your capacity rather than narrowing it down to what you prefer to do. So when you looked at your scores on the profile, your high scores relative to the other scores would probably suggest that you're using that more so than other ways, and your low scores would suggest that perhaps you're not using those approaches as much as you perhaps could. And then finally, what we're going to do in this hour is look at some case studies and consider which way you might negotiate or deal with the conflict situation that I put before you. So that'll get us through to the hour. And as I said, if you've got questions, comments, observations, please put them in the question box and I will deal with them as we go. All right, so let's look, as I said, up front with political skills for leaders. And let's consider that for a moment. So I'm going to share with you a model, and the first thing that I'm going to put up is this line. When it comes up on your screen, there we go. You have got people in your organisation who are, I would refer to as game players. In other words, they're always playing games, they're always trying to get some sort of a advantage, fair or otherwise. And you've got people on the other end of the continuum who act with integrity. And most of us actually fall somewhere between the two, if the truth be known. But there's the first axis. And the next one is looking at, I'll just put this up. We're looking at, there we go. We're looking at people who at the top are politically aware and people at the bottom who are politically unaware. So that's the structure for the model of political awareness. And we have 4 categories. So let's look at the first category, which are people who are game players, who are politically aware. and we'll use animals to depict these people. We'll call these people foxes. So foxes are people who are always trying to play the political game, and normally they're reasonably good at it, but the trick is that everybody else in the organisation that they deal with probably know that they're a fox. In other words, people are very wary of people like this. And you don't have to be an elected representative to be a fox necessarily. You can certainly be a senior officer and be a fox. Now, we don't want you to be a fox, but certainly I'm sure you'd recognise people that fit that category inside your organisation. The next category, which is people who are game players but are politically unaware, we will refer to them as donkeys, right? So these are people who basically try to play the game but are pretty poor at it. And frankly, everyone sort of realizes that they're a bit of a donkey, that they're not very good at playing this political game. So we clearly don't want you to be a donkey, because donkeys are game players who are politically unaware, and that's not what we want. Now, we need you to be on the other side of this model. So let's have a look at what's on the other side. So people who act with integrity but are politically unaware, we would classify them as lambs, and we might even say lambs to the slaughter. So these are people who, in your workplace, I'm sure you lead some people like this, who say to you, I'm not interested in playing politics. I just come to work, I do a good job, and I'm really not interested in all the other stuff that goes on around me. Now, the reason why that's problematic, of course, is that you get two people on a desert island and there's politics. So politics is everywhere. It's not necessarily something that you enter into. It's something that you're just part of by virtue of being part of an organisation. You are part of it. So being a lamb is actually not effective, because you're not actually working in isolation. You are working with and through other people on a range of different issues and complexity, and it's no point in being a lamb, because you need to be politically aware. Although I would say that lambs often do take pride in being politically unaware. They just say that I don't opt into politics. It's just not my thing. And where we need you to be is wise. Now, people who are wise are politically aware, who act with integrity. So you see, you can actually be politically aware and still have integrity. It is possible. I might say to you, though, that of course the further up you go the organisation, the more difficult it is to actually enact that, because things often at more senior levels in organisations are grey, shades of grey. They're often not black and white. And because they're shades of grey, you're often balancing the need to act with integrity and also act politically in a politically savvy way. So I would strongly recommend, if you want to be good at negotiation and you want to be good at dealing with conflict, generally speaking, you need to be the wise owl. So I leave that with you because I want you to think about that in terms of your own careers and where you are now. You can't afford not to be politically aware, and if you are, you've got two choices. You can act with integrity or you can be a game player, and I strongly recommend that the best way forward is the ones who act in a wise manner. So you might also use this model, because I'll be sending you the slides, of course, this afternoon. You might also use this model to talk to some of the people that you lead who elect to be the innocent lamb, and just to point out to them that in their own development and in their own interests, they need to be basically above the line, in other words, wise. So all political awareness is, in my view, is being empathetic to the actions and reactions that other people may incur as a result of your actions. So if you write a report or you send an email or you make a presentation or you make a statement, you being politically aware is considering the impact of that on the wider community. That's all it is, in my view. So really the model's to say you can be politically aware and act with integrity. So hopefully that's been a bit of fun, but you can also categorise some of the people in your organisation on that grid. Now, if you've done your survey, you will have known that there is a model there, and what I would ask you to do right now, if it's in front of you, is get your 5 scores, that is your scores for competing, avoiding, compromising, accommodating, and collaborating. So get those scores, and what I'd like you to do on the model that's in the notes that you would have printed out is to write your scores next to each, so that while I talk about each, it'll be fairly obvious to you where you stand. So that will be helpful for you if you've just got that in front of you. But if you haven't, or you haven't done it, don't panic. You can always do this later. So on the one side there, on the left-hand side, you have the degree of assertiveness. Right at the bottom of the model is low assertiveness. At the top of the model on the left-hand side is high assertiveness. Now, assertiveness doesn't mean aggression. It means speaking your mind and speaking up when you need to speak up. Now, across the top, we have another axis called cooperativeness. So on the left-hand side is low cooperativeness, and on the right-hand side there is high cooperativeness. All right, so cooperativeness is where you're willing to work with and through other people in order to get the job done. All right, so hopefully that's clear. And then in the position, and the persons that put this together have the name Thomas and Kilman. It's a very famous model, this, and it's certainly stood the test of time, and it is timeless. And if you think about it as a negotiation strategy, you've got 5 choices, okay? 5 choices to deal with conflict. So what I might do is start up here with competing. So you can see that competing is high on assertion and low on cooperativeness. So when you're competing with somebody in negotiation, or when you're competing with someone in a conflict, what you're actually doing is it's a win-lose. What you're trying to do is win at the expense of the other person. Now, that's why it's low on cooperativeness, because obviously if you win and the other person loses, then there's not much cooperation there. But in order to win, you have to be quite assertive. So things such as health and safety, things that are non-negotiable, that are in black and white, these are things where you would hold the ground because you're actually in the right, or you're the custodian of that particular policy in your local government organisation. So competing. Now have a look at your score on competing. Now if you scored, and I should say to you, what's a relatively high and low score? 10 plus, you can only get 12. 10 plus is a high score, and 2 and below is a low score. So have a look at your score on competing. Now, if it's a relatively low score, and even if it's a 3 or maybe even a 4, you might ask yourself the question, do I do enough competing in my workplace? Or do I allow other people perhaps to take advantage of me? And that's a very brutally honest assessment, because you may well justify why you don't compete for all sorts of reasons, like let sleeping dogs lie, don't want to open a can of worms, and so on. But I would argue that there is a time and a place for you as a leader where you really need to stand up and hold the line on a particular point of view. Not everything, of course, and if you had a high score on that, you probably think basically more things than the more that you are competing perhaps justifiably on a lot of things. So competing is one of those areas. So if we go down now to the opposite of competing. Now, what's the opposite of competing? The opposite of competing is accommodating. It's high on cooperativeness and it's low on assertion. So this is where you let the other party win. So in other words, you give in to the views and wishes of another person. Now, why in heaven's name would you want to do that? Well, if you think that they have a more important point of view than you, genuinely, you would possibly be stand corrected and allow them to have it their way. On the other hand, if you think that the relationship, that is your working relationship with the person, is more important than the task or the situation that you're involved in, then you may elect to accommodate their point of view. Now, those of us in personal relationships would understand implicitly that we have to spend a lot of time accommodating because the relationship often has to take precedent over the things that we're arguing about. So we end up accommodating in situations where perhaps we may not otherwise want to accommodate. So have a look at your scores on the model. Do you have a high score or a low score in accommodation? So if it's a relatively low score, it probably suggests that you are looking at everything as a win-lose paradigm, but more importantly, something that you feel very reluctant to give over to. So in other words, you're not allowing other people to get some brownie points, or as the old cliche goes, you're not allowing them to win the battles so that you can win the war. So, but then again, if you've got a very high score in accommodating, it may well mean that you're being too much of a pushover. You're allowing people to take advantage of your goodwill, and sometimes you really need to put your foot down and take a stand. Because interestingly enough, if you've got a high score in accommodating, it's probably highly likely that what's happening is that people are either pushing very hard when they want to convince you of something because they know that it's likely that you may cave in, or that's probably likely what's happening. So you're actually creating a rod for your own back by accommodating too often. So think about that for a moment. So what might be the middle way between accommodating and competing? Well, that's compromising. You'll notice it's right in the middle of the model, and compromising means that there's got to be a bit of give and take, but there's got to be some degree of assertion. Otherwise, you won't get anything that you want. And compromising is really you getting a little bit of what you want, and the other person getting a little bit of what they want. Okay, a classic example of that, of course, is buying a house. Normally, the seller doesn't get the price that they want, and the buyer doesn't necessarily get the price that they want to pay. That you'll often meet somewhere in the middle, and if you're working through a real estate agent, the real estate agent's job, of course, is to try to find some middle ground. And I think in our Australian culture, and certainly in local government, I think there's a general culture that compromising is an appropriate form of negotiation. But the interesting thing about compromising is that you're not 100% happy because you haven't got everything that you want, nor, I might say, is the other party, because they have to compromise too, and they haven't got all that they want either. So it's kind of like a middle way. So that leaves us two others. Now, have a look, first of all, before I move to the other two, have a look at your score on compromising. If you've got a high score on compromising, that is relative to the other scores, I think it'd be fair to say that you spend too much time trying to find the middle way. Now, the reality is there are some situations where there isn't necessarily a middle way. And what that means is that you've got to try one of the other 4 strategies and give over to those strategies rather than to continue to compromise. If you had a high score on compromising, it's probably highly likely that when you're dealing with someone that doesn't want to compromise with you, for whatever reason, it can be hugely frustrating for you. And the reason it's frustrating for you is that you put a lot of stock into compromising, and that's why your score's high. And so therefore, you are left with very little to work with because you're so comfortable with the notion of compromise. So have a think about that. And if you had a low score in compromising, the opposite's true, that perhaps you should do a little bit more looking for the middle ground. And so I strongly recommend that you perhaps do that. Now, let's go up to collaboration. Collaboration is high on assertion and high on cooperativeness. So collaboration is different to compromising. Compromising is where you give a little bit and they give a little bit and you end up with something in the middle. Collaboration, on the other hand, is where you are both willing to work together to try to come up with another resolution that is different to what you might originally have thought, that where you're happy and the other party's happy as well. And you might say, well, isn't that the ideal solution? Out of all of those 5, wouldn't that be the way to go? And probably the answer to that is yes. But the truth of the matter is, when you're collaborating, it takes a lot of time because it means you've got to have you've got to talk to the other party. You've got to be prepared to look at other options. You've got to consider different pathways. And because of that, it takes time. And the reality is, in local government, like everywhere else, you just don't have a lot of time. And so therefore you can really not afford the luxury of collaborating. And of course the other issue is that the other party may not see any possibility of collaborating. So you have a situation where it's not always applicable. Now, if you had a relatively high score there, then you can completely understand what I'm talking about. And if you have a low score there, perhaps you're not doing enough of that. And I might suggest to you that your key learning out of today's Lunch and Learn would be to do more collaborating in the circumstances and with the people where it's relevant. In other words, if the situation is important to both parties and the relationship between you and the other party is crucial to success generally, then that gives grounds to collaborate. Now, have a look at your compromising score and have a look at your collaboration score. Here's an insight. If your compromising score is relatively high and your collaboration score is relatively low, and I find that that's not uncommon, then probably there's a lesson in there that when you're trying to compromise or negotiate around a compromise with another party and you're not getting anywhere for whatever reason, instead of going to one of the other areas, competing, avoiding, or accommodating, you may then consider looking at the other person and asking them a question. Are you willing to work with me to see if we can come up with another way that we can deal with this issue? Great question, and it tests whether or not the other party is willing to collaborate with you. Now, you might be pleasantly surprised and they say, yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, but I can't really see how we can deal with it unless we compromise. Then you can then say, well, good, well, let's just brainstorm. Let's just think about some ways forward here for a moment. where we can get both of our needs met and all the while maintaining our working relationship. Okay? So that, and of course, that would happen with developers, around, working with the sort of, the town plan that, you would try and work through to a win-win situation. And, but also, of course, it can work internally for you as well. So if your score was high here and low here, my strong suggestion is that you become more collaborative in your working relationships with other people as a way forward. Now, just before we do our final one, which is avoiding, let me say this, that in any negotiation, there are three critical factors. One of those factors is your natural style, and if you've done the profile, you'll know what that natural style is, and if you haven't, then you can find out. So your natural style will dictate your preferences about how you might go about the negotiation. The second variable is the other person or person's natural style. Remember, they've got a influence. They've got a conflict profile as well. They might not have completed Thomas Kilman's questionnaire that you've done, but they've certainly got a style and an approach that's well honed, and they've been using it for a period of time. So that will have an impact as well on the negotiation. And the third element is, of course, the situation that you're in or the task that you're trying to resolve. So there are three aspects of it. Now, let me give you a practical example before I look at avoiding. Well, before I do that, let's look at avoiding. Now, avoiding is low on assertion and low on cooperativeness. Now, at first glance, it might say, you might think, well, hang on, that's not a very good approach because we're not doing anything. Well, there are lots of circumstances in local government where it is actually prudent to avoid. All right? So your best course of action is to actually avoid in certain circumstances where there's conflict. For example, if you're in a meeting and somebody says something that's factually incorrect, but it has absolutely no bearing on the conversation outcome, then sometimes it might be a good idea for you to close your mouth, bite your tongue until it bleeds, and say nothing. Why? Well, because you don't want to derail the negotiation. You don't want to take it off on a tangent where, we're arguing about detail. All right, so there's an example where avoiding would be a very smart strategy. Another example might be that you're being approached. I know we've got some CEOs in here, so if you're a CEO, you might be approached by the mayor, or if you're a senior officer, you might be approached by the CEO. And the CEO or the mayor asks you a very pointed question. In other words, they want some information about something that you're doing or not doing in your directorate. And once they've asked you the question, you haven't got an answer. In other words, the answer isn't at your fingertips. So you can quite easily say to the mayor or the CEO, leave it with me, I'll go and investigate and find out the answer to that question. All right? So what you've done is you've bought yourself some time. Now, I'm not suggesting you use it as a fob off. What I mean by that is you actually do go and investigate it, and you do come back with an answer, but you bought yourself some time by avoiding at that point. Of course, the opposite would be for you just to blurt out the first thing that came into your mind, find out later it's wrong. So you can see how you could use avoiding. So let me give you a very practical example where you could use 4 of these 5 strategies when you're dealing with a conflict situation. Let's assume that there are 2 people in your area who happen to be having an altercation. Now, at this early stage of the altercation, it looks as if both parties are just letting off a bit of steam, and your thinking to yourself is, they're mature adults, they should be able to sort out their own problem, and I won't intervene. So you're initially going to use avoiding because you're assuming that, of course, they can deal with this conflict. But after a minute or two, you notice that the voices are raised to another couple of decibels, and it's starting to get quite heated. And you think to yourself, well, I'm responsible for this because it's my area. And you decide to pull both of those people offline and into an office. And you are then going to talk to each party about the situation of which there's conflict. So you ask both parties to comment. So now what you're trying to do is to compromise. You're actually wanting both people to give you an explanation because what you're looking for is a middle ground. Now, let's say that both of these people have got their arms folded and their eyes crossed, and they're really not interested at all in compromising. So that's not going to work. So you then ask both people, are you two willing to work with me to resolve this so that you both get your needs met? Okay, so you try that, and both parties are less than optimistic. And in fact, both parties do not want to collaborate either. So I've now tried to avoid it. I've now tried to compromise. I've now tried to collaborate. I'm now going over here to competing. I'm now going to say to both people, listen, you two, you've got to work together. That's the reality of it. And I want you to sort this out. And I want you both to work with each other. And I don't want any explanation other than you will both work together. So you can actually effectively see that you can use 4 different strategies in the one conflict situation. And you can see that maybe none of them work, but the very fact that you've gone through 4 strategies bumps up the possibilities of you getting the result that you want significantly. So you see my point? You see how it's important to be flexible. But obviously, knowing your profile, you've probably got, some favoured approaches in here, or even in the accommodation, which you haven't necessarily used, and you will delude yourself into believing that that particular strategy is the only strategy that will work for you at this time. Big mistake. All right, so the homework for you, and I don't mean necessarily bringing this back in 2 weeks, but the key point out of this for you is to work very hard to lift your lower scores and to make sure that your higher scores are not dominating your approach to negotiation and conflict. That makes sense. Okay. So let's talk about when you can use each of these approaches. All right. So when would it be a good idea for you to use competing? That's when you get your own needs met at the expense of the other person. All right. Well, when speed and decisiveness are necessary, so obviously if time's running out and a decision has to be made, you just might make a unilateral decision and say to the other party, I'm going to make this decision because I don't have time to discuss it with you. So in those circumstances, you would be within your rights to compete. Another opportunity to use competing is when the other party, whoever it is actually taking advantage of you through your goodwill. So you're showing a lot of goodwill and a lot of faith, and another party says, weakness, I'm going to go in for the kill, and you've decided enough is enough, and you've decided to stand up for your own values and what you believe in, and you have arrested that attempt to ride roughshod over your approach by competing yourself. So that would be valid and reasonable to use it in those circumstances. And thirdly, what about a situation where you have to make an unpopular decision and quite frankly, nobody is actually going to be happy about the decision? Aren't you in the best position then to actually let people know what the decision is? You may even preface it by saying to them, you mightn't like this decision, or you probably won't like this decision, or I know you won't want me to implement this decision, however, and then you jump in and make the decision because you're never going to please them anyway. So why bother trying? Why not just simply make the decision? But to acknowledge to the other party that it's okay to have that point of view, but this is the way we're going. So, what about accommodation, which is at the opposite end of the scale? Whoop, I went too far. Just go back a notch. There we go. It's on your screen now. So, when would you allow the other person to win? Okay. If the relationship is more important than the issue, in other words, if you crash through with the task and you think that it's going to damage the working relationship that you have with that person, then really you give over because you don't want the relationship to suffer. Now, I would hope that this would happen fairly regularly with CEOs working with mayors. I would hope that it would happen perhaps with CEOs working with their senior team because they acknowledge that the relationship is something. I have to work with this person on an ongoing basis. Now, in another case, if you know that you're not going to have your needs met, in other words, you're going to get rolled, then it might well be a good idea for you to just take the initiative and let the other person win. And so you get the brownie points with showing the initiative to get the other person to feel that they've won it. But all the while you understand full well that there is no way that you're going to get your decision up anyway. So that would be a case where you would accommodate. And thirdly, if the situation isn't that important, and why would you bother? Why would you bother? So if it's not important, just let it go. It really doesn't worry you. There's enough bun fights around in organisations to worry about without going around and not accommodating in certain circumstances. Okay, so we're now going to the bottom left-hand corner. When would you use the avoidance strategy? Let me put up a couple of examples. If you need to use diplomacy to smooth over a situation, then it's a good idea to do that. I often have people say to me, I'm a straight shooter and I just tell it as it is. Well, that's all very fine. It sounds very honourable, but it also means just because people don't like getting shot. So sometimes it might be a good idea to just use diplomacy. Say nothing, in other words, or just avoid it and just let the person have their own view. If you have to put off a decision until there's a better time and there's a heated conversation going on between you and somebody else or another team, it might be a good idea for you just to say, time out, let's give it some time before we reconvene. That'll give everyone a chance to think through carefully of what's been said. So that would be a case where you'd use avoiding. Another example is neither the relationship nor the issue is important to you, so why would you get involved? Just let it go. And I think you should be letting go of more things than taking up in your own area, that where there's no relationship at stake and the issue is not that big a deal. And of course, as I said before, when you need to know more before taking action, it's perfectly relevant for you to take a space to give yourself a time to collect the information that you need before taking the action that's required. So you can see that there's quite legitimate reasons for you and me to avoid certain situations. So I'd ask you to practice that if it's not something that you're naturally good at. So, when would you collaborate? Now, collaboration, remember, is high on assertiveness and high on cooperativeness. This is where you're coming up with another way forward that hasn't been considered. So, if the situation for both parties is important and the relationship with both parties is important, then it's strongly recommended that you both try and collaborate and work your way through it to come up with a resolution where you get both your needs and the needs of the other party met. But of course, as you know, the significant downside of collaboration is that it takes time. What about when an outcome that satisfies both parties is sought? So this is where you really do need, or there is motivation for both parties who are 100% committed to solving a problem. That's fertile ground for collaboration. Or if you want a creative solution that needs to be found, not something that's stock standard, then it might well be a good idea to then move into collaboration, assuming the other party's interested in doing that. So you can see that collaboration does have its place in local government. In terms of compromising, if time's running out, say for example you might be collaborating and we've got to make a decision by the close of business today on Friday, then you may just say to the other person involved, look, we can't afford to spend any more time collaborating. We really need to come to a compromise because we have to make a decision by the close of business this afternoon. Sometimes it can be used when collaboration or competing fail. Absolutely, as I said, when you might have started out collaborating but may end up compromising, or vice versa, of course. Sometimes it's good if it's a temporary solution. So this might be in a case where you just simply want to get a temporary result on the board. This is what we might call the band-aid approach. Sometimes compromising may well be the only way. So if you're dealing, for example, in an enterprise bargaining scenario, or you're dealing with something complex where there might be several stakeholders involved, compromise may well be the only way forward. Now, what I want to say here is each of I won't go through all this, but each of these strategies have, they have advantages and disadvantages. And my comment to you is when you're under pressure, I would suggest that you, instead of just banging on your preferred style, that you stop and try a plan B or a plan C or a plan D or indeed even a plan E. That would be what I would strongly recommend. So what I want to do now is look at some scenarios or situations and give you some thought in the last few minutes that we've got today on how you might, and of course if you've got any questions then please type them in and I'll keep an eye on the question box as well. But look at situation one. Customer has called you. They want you to handle an order for him. You no longer work in that team, and it would create a major problem internally if you cross departments. However, the customer who orders a moderate amount of product has been very insistent with you. I'm sure this sort of thing happened after amalgamation when people were no longer working in that centre or whatever. So here's somebody in your face. They want to deal with you. They feel very comfortable dealing with you, and but you know that really roles and responsibilities have changed and you really shouldn't be dealing with that. Let's look at what you can't do or what you shouldn't do, right? The very first thing that you shouldn't do, and you might be surprised about this, is accommodating. If you let them win, in other words, you deal with whatever it is that they want you to deal with, you've created a rod for your own back. Because the next time they've got an issue, they're likely to come to you rather than the correct person because, you've given them good cooperation. Okay? So you certainly wouldn't use accommodation. I don't think it's very prudent to compete. I think if you said to the person, look, I'm not going to help you. I no longer work in that department and you need to go and see Mary in accounts. Now, if you do that, you're probably likely to annoy the person and you're probably not going to be very effective. You can't avoid it because the fact is they're wanting an answer and you can't just sit there and say nothing or suggest that they postpone it. They want their thing now. So that's not going to work. So there's only really two options open to you. One of them is compromise and one of them is collaboration. So the obvious one to me would be a collaboration, where you might say to the customer, look, what I'll do is I'll introduce you to Fred or Mary. Fred and Mary is now basically charged with the responsibility of dealing with those issues. So how about I get Fred and Mary to give you a call? And of course, the idea is that Fred and Mary then will partially, they'll probably be happy because they're dealing with the right person. You'll be happy. Everyone will be happy. It's a compromise or collaboration. So I think that's the answer. Let's look at number two. And number two is a personal one. You have had your car in for a service and you have had it repaired, and although they claim it's fixed, you've got the same problem. It's not a regular fault and it's obvious. You paid your bill when you collected the car and you're not prepared to pay any more. I'm sure we've all had this happen before. They're the only dealer that is at all convenient to you and you want your car fixed now. So what do? Well, let's have a look. You can't avoid it because you need your car, so that's not going to work for you. You could accommodate, I guess, but you actually don't think that you're in the wrong. In other words, you're not actually in the wrong. So why should you accommodate and why should you pay extra money for a fault that should have been fixed? So that's not going to work. It's hard to see how you could compromise there, and I don't think collaboration is very handy. The only one that I think you should use, I hope you agree with me, is to compete. So, to firmly but kindly say to the other person, look, when I put my car in, that noise was there, it's still there, and I'd like it to be fixed immediately, please. When would you be able to get it done? So I'm moving into that because, the fact of the matter is they did make a mistake and you have to fix that up. Scenario three. Scenario three is you're a manager of a team that currently has a manual recording system and your analysis shows greater productivity if it's automated. Susan Jones runs a similar kind of operation in another team. She disagrees with your proposition, citing customer concerns and employees and employee resistance, plus technical problems with the system that you're proposing. Your manager has told you that you must resolve this with Susan because you both must run the same way. If that's the case, then you can't compromise. You can't have half an automated system and half a manual system. So compromise is not going to work. You can't really compete because Susan's on the same level as you. So she has as much positional power that you have. So that's not going to work. You can't avoid it because your boss has told you that you must fix it. You shouldn't accommodate because the reality is that your way could be more effective than Susan's. So just by caving in to Susan's demands may well be not in the best interests of the team. So compromising collaboration is the only way to sit down with Susan and try and work through a system. So you might say to Susan, how about we do it your way for a week, and then we do a trial of my way for the next week, and how about we get our team together and we work out which is the better way. Now that to me sounds like the sensible way through that. Scenario number 4, and this is very common, more common than we'd probably think. Your boss has a personal dislike for one of your team, and is insisting on you firing that person. While you recognise some occasional problems, you can manage that quite easily, and that person is in fact important to the team output. Now, what wouldn't you do? Well, I don't think you should accommodate because, frankly, it's a personal dislike. So it's got nothing to do with the work, and the work's fine. So I don't think you just caving into the boss's demand is a very smart way of doing business. Certainly, they're not going to appreciate, that's the person that's been sacked, they're not going to appreciate their contract not being renewed, and nor, I might say, would be anyone else in your team who saw the treatment that that they were getting, because they'd be thinking, well, if that's the way they're going to treat Fred, how might they treat me in the same way? Would he or she actually stand up for me in those circumstances? Okay, so really you've got a couple of options. You could compromise, you could move that person to another shift or another roster, out of sight, out of sight, out of mind. That might be well worth a try. You might collaborate with your manager and ask him or her if you could talk to this team member, and if you could try and work on a local level with his bedside manner, it might improve the working relationship between them and the boss. All right? You could you could avoid it. You might say, how do you do that? Well, if you think they're half joking when they made the statement, perhaps in the car on the way from somewhere, you might just test the water and say nothing and just see whether he or she brings it up again. And assuming he or she brings it up again, then you really know that you've got an issue on your hands. So you can see, working your way through, there will be some preferred approaches to use. Now, the last one before we finish up. A manager, you want to design a new system in a way that suits you as a manager. Your approach at the managers' meeting is to raise it with the other managers who are all affected by the proposed new system. One of the other managers says it's too costly that way, and that each manager should simply offer their approach and the general manager make their decision. Well, I don't think you should accommodate, because I think in the room there's probably enough people who may have a good idea about how to move forward. And also you're lumping the responsibility of the decision to the general manager who's asked you specifically to solve the problem. So that's not going to work. You can't really avoid it because the reality is the general manager wants a decision. Okay. There will be a little bit of collaboration that will come out of this, because there needs to be a discussion around how it'll work. But I think collaboration and compromise are the way forward, because I think the team has to come up with the resolution or the suggestion proposal initially and see what the manager thinks about that. And I don't think there's really room to compete on something like that where there's several of your colleagues in the room. So, guys, if you've got any questions before we wrap up, that gives you some indication of how it all works. And you might want to think about that yourself as to which. Okay, no questions at this stage. You're a quiet, hopefully happy bunch today. So let's have a look. Your key messages out of today are simply this. We have a question. Okay. Handy. Quite logical when you think about it. Yeah, thanks, Joe, for the feedback. That's great. I hope it is. It is very logical when you think about it. The three key messages are, thank you. Thanks, Tim. That was really handy. Quite logical when you think about it. Okay, sorry, that was the same one. I read the same one. Look, the messages are be flexible. Don't overuse your preferred style. If plan A doesn't work, then go to plan B. Don't just drop the ball. Actually try something different, and that will work for you. So your homework, and I'm sure this won't surprise you, your homework is to practice using all 5 styles. And in particular, what I want you to do is to use the ones that you feel least comfortable with. The reason for that is that, of course, I want you to make them comfortable. And if you make them comfortable, you're going to be very, very unstoppable when it comes to being a good negotiator. So I'd ask you to consider all 5, depending on the situation that you're in, the other person's preferences, and of course what your preferences are as well. So folks, that's where we'll finish up. I want to wish you all a lovely weekend and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time when we will look at our final module in the Executive Lunch and Learn. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully you've got something really useful out of